student who is not able to be with us. So anyway, we'll wait a little bit here. But you've probably seen, David, that we've been testing the extremes of concepts, right? Getting rid of medical specialties. When you talk to doctors about that, there's a terror in their eyes that you couldn't have put there any other way, you know? Holy smokes. And then genetically engineering radiation-resistant humans to allow us to lead a Star Trek life. You know, that's just one detail that Star Trek didn't quite get right, that doing what they do on Star Trek, an unaltered human would be fried alive by the radiation, you know, so, or have to live underground, right? So you could go to Mars, but you could not live on the surface. Your radio-resistant progeny could live on the surface and you could communicate. So that's what we talked about last time. So those two things. So yeah, and I think you'll test the limits still further of what concept.
I'm afraid you're going to have to guide and steer me, because I don't have a set talk. I can talk broadly of
no, I'm quite happy to do that. I also realize that as the course director, I have exhibited defective performance here in that I didn't mention anything about this, what they should do to prepare for today until, you know, the last 24 hours. So, and they may have actually had something else to do rather than just watching David Pearce videos every waking moment. So some of them will have watched virtually no David Pearce videos. It's hard to imagine any human being alive who would never watch the David Pearce video. But anyway, so there'll be some variation, and that's not their fault, that's my fault that we were so excited about these other things that I didn't send them a list of videos. But just as you say, you are such a fount of knowledge of all different types that we could keep talking forever, I'm sure. And even if it's just you and me, the students will still get something out of it. So anyway, that's
I hope so, Kim.
Yes, yeah. So I'm going back to John Lennon. We'll see if he can inspire us here. So the students would have noticed that virtually every teaching session, we talk about artificial intelligence and how machines are getting smarter than we are. So maybe we would start with David Pearce telling us what he means by full spectrum superintelligence and what might be missing in this intelligence that machines will acquire that in many respects is way beyond what we could do, but will there be some things missing? So is that a good starting point?
That's a good starting point, but it's extremely ambitious. Yes, what is meant by full spectrum superintelligence? By full spectrum superintelligence, I mean some form of transhuman, post-human being that not merely has an off-the-scale IQ, the kind of narrow autistic intelligence measured by today's IQ tests, but also a being that has superhuman cognition, ability to apprehend, intuit the perspectives of others, superhuman capacity for cooperative problem solving, superhuman capacity for introspective self-insight, higher order intentionality. Intentionality is this philosophy jargon for he hopes that I believe that she wants, that he thinks that Shakespeare could manage 6th order intentionality. Most people struggle with 5. But okay, I'll go on in this list of desiderata for full spectrum superintelligence. Full spectrum superintelligence will need to be able to navigate altered state spaces of consciousness as different as waking from dreaming consciousness, different forms of psychedelic consciousness, full spectrum superintelligence. And what's striking about so-called AI today is that it's not full spectrum, not remotely. For a start, classical digital computers or classical connectionist systems, they can't solve the binding problem. So they're either zombies or possibly micro experiential zombies. Now, what is the binding problem? I don't know who's come across it before. It's a bit of a mystery, because even if consciousness is fundamental in the world, why aren't you just a micro experiential zombie in the same way as when you're dreamlessly asleep, you're a micro experiential zombie? If orthodox neuroscience is correct, you should at most be 86 billion odd membrane bound nerve cells, pixels of experience. But how, therefore, is it possible for phenomenal binding to occur? Because somehow, right now, you are apprehending both perceptual objects within your visual field, but also your mind-brain is running a unified phenomenal world simulation. This is the unity of perception, unity of the self. This is tremendously computationally, functionally adaptive. If one wants to see how adaptive it is, one needs to perhaps just look at cases of simultanagnosia. Someone with simultanagnosia can only see one object at once, or motion blindness. Someone with motion blindness can't actually perceive motion. So however we do it, phenomenal binding is tremendously adaptive, fitness enhancing, but it's indistinguishable from magic. And although if one reads stories in the news about developments in AI, GPT-3, all this kind of stuff, nonetheless, digital computers are zombies, and it's anthropomorphic projection to say they're either sentient or sapient. However, what is shortly going to be possible, as prefigured by Neuralink, is for you to have so-called narrow superintelligence on a chip. So all the things that classical digital computers or connectionist systems can do, you can have miniaturized and a microchip. So you're going to be able to do them too. But full spectrum superintelligence is going to be far, far richer than anything commonly conceived as such today. Okay, I've made one or two quite controversial remarks. If anyone has any criticisms or queries, feel free to fire away.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. Go
So,
ahead.
So to reach this full spectrum superintelligence, do you imply that at some point we would need to hybridize ourselves with some sort of metal or chip that could allow us to get that information from, I don't know, the wireless internet?
Yes, I mean, there would be ways to create biological superintelligence without AI. I mean, for example, one could get von Neumann's DNA. He's buried at Princeton, and have lots of von Neumann clones, hothouse the products, tweaking them in some kind of recursive cycle of improvement. This would be purely biological. But rather than relying on our biological wetware alone, it should be possible to, essentially have what is often known as artificial intelligence today, and incorporate it in a kind of neurochip. I mean, you could say that's cheating, but I'm not really sure that's very sensible. It's essentially everything that classical digital computers can do, you can do, and more, at least once the technology of proper interfacing is sorted out.
Are there other questions at this point? So I don't think it hurts us to jump around just to make sure that we cover all the potential high points. So something completely unrelated to superintelligence is the idea of how much better the world would work if all decision-making and leadership roles were in the hands of women. So David has also been writing about this for a long time. It isn't that he thinks it's practical. He knows that the politics of putting all leadership roles in the hands of women would never work. But still, in a lot of ways, it is appealing to think of how ideal such a world would work and why. And then one of you will bring up Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher does not disprove this, because even she was not as territorial as most male leaders would have been. So we're not saying that women are perfect or all angels or there are no evil women, but just that they in a lot of ways, they don't do things that lead to wars generally. And so the world will be a much more peaceful place. Now that's just me parroting David. David, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this with nuance?
Yes,
and,
I mean, we have drink drive laws. Now, drink drive laws are discriminatory. There are people who can drive more competently after a few pints than other people can who are completely sober. But nonetheless, we recognize that however crude and discriminatory drink drive laws are, they save many lives. Now, if we go to somewhere where the stakes are much, much higher, namely war and peace, fact is, history doesn't record a single case of women banding together for the purposes of territorial wars of aggression. This is true of chimpanzees, and it's true of humans too. And if you think it is highly likely that weapons of mass destruction, not least thermonuclear weapons, are going to be used this century, it's almost certainly going to be because of male decision makers. And if we were ethically serious about wanting to prevent catastrophic war, then I think we would adopt the principle of all-female political leadership, possibly enacting legislation that kicked in perhaps, let's say, 10, 15 years' time, because existing leaders wouldn't want to cede power. Now, although in one sense, Kim suggested that I'd been writing about this, it's more a case of, if asked, I will express an opinion on the subject. Probably this is not sociologically realistic, but yeah, it's tragic. Most likely, hundreds of millions of people are going to die this century in terrible wars, when there is, in fact, a safety measure we could take to prevent it, which is the principle of all-female political governance. And of course, it's terribly crude, because there are plenty of men who are not warlike by nature and wouldn't favour an arms budget or an excessive arms budget. But just to conclude, I think it's very telling that even people like me, who would describe themselves as almost pacifists, opposed to any form of violence, how do we relax? First-person shooters, violent video games. Essentially, nature designed male human primates to hunt and to wage war, and therefore putting male human primates in charge in an era of WMD is potentially catastrophic.
So, there's another side of this, which is to look at what males are naturally better at. And for most of human history, that's been a very necessary thing, which is faking knowing what's going on when you really cannot know what's going on, and making leadership decisions based on no information whatsoever, just going with your gut when you don't have the information. And in the future, that will never be the case. We may have too much information, it may be unsorted, may be hard to interpret, but we will never have to make major decisions in the absence of the necessary information. But in past, we often had to do that, and men are very good and convincing at making decisions based on something or other and having people lead them. They have this skill, but it's a somewhat outmoded skill, one that is not needed anymore, because there's so much more information in the world, and women are much better at being, collaborative and stuff, and putting multiple ideas together. So it isn't that men aren't superior at some things, it's the things that they're superior at, physical strength and pretending that you know what's going on when you really don't. Those are not as valuable as they used to be. So, yeah, that's the other side of it. Yeah.
How do you propose, Dr. Pearce, to implement that idea, to go into a world in which the governments should be predominantly female? Do you have some sort of suggestions that you would like to share with us? Because maybe we won't see it in our lifetime, but we could evolve that way. Do you have any suggestions?
It's, as I said, because I don't regard it as sociologically realistic, I haven't invested time suggesting ways we could agitate for it. To have any hope of success, as I said, there would need to be some kind of delayed onset clause. I mean, all kinds of horrible ills in our society, I think, are potentially fixable if one enacts legislation that only kicks in 10, 15, 20 years' time. Something like, the horrors of factory farming and slaughterhouses. I would favor getting rid of them now, but if we pass legislation that outlaws them in 10 or 15 years' time, that is perhaps saleable. And if enough people are worried about the threat of nuclear Armageddon, then perhaps this idea would be feasible. Yeah, and one other possible route to world peace, and I say world peace makes one sound incredibly naive and utopian, is essentially going for a democratically elected world government. That's civilization, or what passes for civilization, depended on the nation state claiming a monopoly on the use of violence within its within its borders. At the moment, nationalism has caused most of the wars of the past couple of hundred years. We have heavily armed nation states. If nations of the world were prepared to cede a monopoly of the use of force to a democratically elected UN, once again, measures kicking in only 10, 15 years' time, then this would mitigate the possibility of armed conflict as we see it today. But I fear this is, once again, probably utopian, that the League of Nations, followed by the United Nations, were set up only in the aftermath of a catastrophic global war. And I fear, although eventually there will be a world government, that it is most likely again to take place rising from the ashes of the old order. It's a rather pessimistic thought, but what COVID is going to kill millions, but weapons of mass destruction could easily kill hundreds of millions of people this century, and we've become complacent about it. I mean, the one good thing, if I might make a political point, the only good thing I can think of offhand of Donald Trump is that he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, something sometimes he sounds as though he's already won it. But the fact is that if you have an unstable, demented male primate with access to nuclear weapons, then chances are they're going to get used sooner or later.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention two countries, maybe three. So there's Rwanda, Iceland, and Botswana that have predominantly female governance. But you may know some more details about that. Rwanda is post-genocide. They had a horrific genocide there. And the reason that they have so many female legislators now, in part, is because most male leaders on both sides were killed off in the genocide and so on. But you may be aware in the last week. So you might say, okay, but now the country's good. Now there are women in charge and the country's good, right? I mean, sure, millions had to die, but no, the country's not good. So during the genocide, there was this hotel owner who saved a lot of people by hiding them in crevices and attics and stuff in the hotels. And he became famous for this. And he left the country, and the current ruler resented his fame and successfully lured him back. And now he's going to be subjected to some terrible fate for having done this. So that's, Rwanda of today, this week. So even though it's mainly women in charge, there still are terrible things going on there. Iceland also has had a lot of female leaders, but let's talk about Botswana. That is really, really interesting. Botswana also has mainly women in charge, but men are officially a joke. I mean, it's amusing in a sad sort of way that every woman is taught how to navigate the fact that men are like a source of sperm for, reproduction, at least temporarily useful. And so you have to sort of tolerate them, but everybody accepts that they are inferior to women in sort of every way. And so like smiles erupt when a man comes in the room because it's just funny being a man. It's like, they're naturally comical humans because they're so incompetent at doing things. So for a woman to visit Botswana something because she will nowhere else in her life encounter this situation of all men being officially a joke. And, you know, women talk about how, you know, you keep husbands happy and that sort of thing in a situation where you don't really respect them at all, but still they're necessary for some things, carry heavy loads and, you know, impregnate women so they can have children and stuff like that. So there are some examples currently, but they're not like ideal examples. And I think that the other way to look at this is there's more and more talk about non-binary sexual orientation, right? So we probably need to think about gender in a little bit more nuanced way. And also men are in a lot of ways becoming less manly. So maybe there's hope, right? Like sperm counts are going down. That's been happening for decades, and you know, average testosterone levels are lower than they were in previous decades, and so on. So maybe we're actually evolving into something that will fit into society a little bit better. David, what do you think about this?
Well, good point. I mean, I look forward to gender going the way of horns and a tail. I was making, the point about all female governments, not with the aim of, you know, an exploration of, you know, all the issues of gender discrimination in our society, orientation, anything like that, but conceived very narrowly in terms of global catastrophic existential risk. And that, if it had been the case that, for example, which it isn't, that, you know, 95% of airplane accidents involve female pilots, I would say there ought to be a regulation that all airline pilots should be male, simply because the risk would be too great. I mean, as I said, it ought to be in theory possible to take a very hard-headed approach and think what will reduce global catastrophic risk. In practice, it's not going to happen. And you were saying the frailties of female leaders. It's more a case of, crudely speaking, a woman can be just as nasty as a man, but women on the whole are not focused on territorial aggression. I mean, there are other, looking at response to COVID, female leaders actually seem to have performed rather better than men. I mean, look at, you know, the example of somewhere like New Zealand, whereas unfortunately, COVID has, instead of being treated as a medical problem, it has become politicized. Wearing a mask is somehow perceived as unmanly, and so in places ranging from, sadly, the USA to Brazil, right-wing authoritarian leaders have performed poorly. But good heavens, what a can of worms. I hadn't planned to discuss gender. we kind of it's not been my primary focus, but it's relevant if one is focused on issues of war and peace.
Yes. Now, let's talk about suffering. And some of the students may be aware that you have various plans for how one would reduce suffering in the world. But they may think about this too simply, like just human suffering, right? Or suffering amongst animals, for instance. But I think David is actually interested in basically eliminating all suffering, maybe not all at once, but like, why should anything have to suffer, right? And so tell us a little bit about the scale of your wish to combat suffering.
Yes, I mean, if it's just a wish, it's ancient, because after all, Buddha said something similar. You know, may all that of life be delivered from suffering. I teach one thing and one thing only: suffering and the end of suffering. What's different now is that, at least in theory, if there were global consensus, one could phase out the biology of suffering altogether, not just in humans, throughout the living world, and replace the biology of pain and malaise with life based entirely on information sensitive gradients of well-being. And one way to wrap one's head around what this involves is to look at today's hedonic outliers. Sadly, quite a few of us are familiar with people who suffer from chronic depression, but there are also people at the opposite end of the scale who essentially have an extremely high hedonic set point, and they go through life pretty much animated by gradients of well-being. They are very unusual, but nonetheless, they really do exist. And if you think it's a good idea to minimize, mitigate, prevent suffering, and replace it by initially gradients of well-being, maybe eventually even gradients of superhuman bliss, then it's possible to sketch how to do this. For a start, and this is what I would advocate, all prospective parents should have access to pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling, and soon CRISPR genome editing, so they can load the genetic dice in favor of their future children. And there are questions of whether you think it's ethically permissible to bring new life and suffering into the world in the first place. Antinatalists would say no. But yeah, I mean, the future belongs to life lovers, such as the nature of selection pressure. But we are now in a position to choose everything from the pain tolerance, pain sensitivity, to the hedonic set point of our future children. Sadly, the first CRISPR babies, which you've probably heard, were conceived recently in China, were not produced in ideal circumstances by any means. But if you agree with the World Health Organization definition of health, as set out in its constitution, health is a state of complete physical, social, mental well-being, then the only way to enjoy such lifelong health that has almost certainly never been experienced by any human in history, is to actually tackle the roots of suffering in our genetic source code. And so, yes, very, very keen on the use of biological genetic solutions to get rid of suffering. Kim mentioned the plight of non-human animals. Yeah, essentially a pig is as sentient and demonstrably as sapient as a pre-linguistic toddler. Pigs and factory farms, slaughterhouses are treated in a way that would get the perpetrator locked up for life if the victim were human. I would strenuously urge anyone present here, anyone listening, to go vegan. In practice, yes, we're going to need cultured meat substitutes, but closing factory farms, slaughterhouses is an absolute moral imperative. They are a stain on our civilization. What we are doing is functionally equivalent to child abuse.
So, yeah, if you look at the African savannah and the way animals kill other animals, you may have thought, well, that isn't fixable, that's just the way it is. But even that, you could imagine a world where you provided food to the animals that used to hunt, and they don't need to hunt anymore. And that may seem to you a sort of aberrant thing to do, but if you really look at the prey, what happens to the animal being killed by a lion it seems like, you know, a pretty bad way to go. So, David, do you want to talk about that?
Yes,
Yeah.
particularly because the idea of phasing out suffering in nature seems so weird. It's often best to start with the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah. Isaiah, recall, prophesies a future where the lion and the wolf lie down with a lamb. So stress the ancient biblical origins of this kind of world. The Bible is a bit light on the technical details, but one can now sketch out in a fair bit of detail how this is feasible. We're only going to do this if we recognize that suffering in nature really is terrible. And yeah, a lot of us are brought up, you know, kind of nature movies, which are kind of idealized, mood music, David Attenborough and so on. They don't bring out the horror. They really don't. And the life of most sentient beings in a state of nature is pretty nasty, brutish, and short. Most non-human animals die of the effects of starvation. Others are eaten alive, disemboweled. It is absolutely ghastly if one investigates what is really going on. However, if one accepts that power gives complicity, we are now complicit in the persistence of suffering in nature. And if we want to, for example, we can use cross-species fertility regulation via, in the case of large terrestrial vertebrates, immunocontraception. And also, and this is very relevant too, we can use CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives. CRISPR is a genome editing technology. Gene drives are a way of pushing desired mutations, alleles across entire species. And let's take the so-called volume knob for pain, SCN9A it's been called. Other genes are involved too, but let's focus on SCN9A. If we want to confer extremely high pain tolerance on members of an entire species, it's possible to use synthetic gene drives. What gene drives do is they cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance and can spread desired mutations across entire sexually reproducing species. And so, yeah, if we want to, we can use biotechnology to do everything from reprogramming predators, a bit of genetic tweaking. Initially, perhaps one could use cultured in vitro meat, you know, catnip-laced in vitro meat for big cats. But one could make more radical alterations too. Essentially, the whole biosphere is programmable, and the level of suffering in the living world is an adjustable parameter. And if we reach the stage of civilization when, yeah, essentially we want to choose how much suffering we want to exist in the living world, well, yeah, it's ultimately up to us. We wouldn't do something like this without pilot studies in self-contained artificial biospheres. And frankly, it's fanciful doing anything like this while we're still systematically abusing and killing non-human animals in factory farms and slaughterhouses. But animal agriculture is going to be phased out this century with the cultured meat revolution. And what then? Do we want to preserve the kind of existing snuff movie? Or do we want to create paradise? And we're not going to run out of computer power. If we want to have a living world in which all sentient beings can flourish without being physically molested, this is feasible with recognizable extensions of existing technologies.
So there's a related idea, and that is that we can presumably in the future increase intellect we will know how to increase our own human intellect. But haven't you ever, it's interesting, those of you who have cats, you're probably already feeling guilty because the behavior that your cats engage in, the things your cats kill, go through a lot of suffering. So it isn't very far from home what David's talking about. It's not just lions and tigers that kill in an unpleasant way. You know, your cat likely does that too. And so it would change things for you if the world were to change in this way. But haven't you ever wanted to talk to your pet and get an idea of what they really think of you? Might be tremendous insights after, you know, their entire lives of you tending them. Then you do an, you know, intellect increase in your pet, and you get a tremendous amount of insights into your own foibles and defects as a pet owner. So David, tell us a bit about this. Yeah.
Well, yes, uplift is possible. Wittgenstein once said that if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him. But actually, I suspect if a lion could speak, we could understand the lion, because the lion has the same pleasure pain axis, the same core emotions as does a human being. Admittedly, I mean, that's a bit simplistic. Only a male lion knows what it's like to be sexually attracted to a female lion, at least, well, I say, best to my knowledge anyway. But nonetheless, the problem I would say is not that we anthropomorphize non-human animals too little, but too much, but too little. Essentially, it's not a case of them being like us, it's a case of being us. That said, yeah, I mean, the way members of the cat family, for example, treat, in the case of a domestic cat, mice, it is pretty ghastly. The cat doesn't understand the implications of what she is doing, tormenting a mouse, but nonetheless, the mouse is a humble mind, and humble minds should be protected. And yeah, if we decide that it's good to live in a world in which humble minds aren't physically molested and tormented as they are today, then yeah, we can tweak the genome of our cats, or alternatively give them catnip-laced mincemeat. I mean, the standard response I get actually is that people say, "Oh, my little tiddles or whatnot wouldn't hurt a fly." But if you probe more closely, you find there have been accidents. And I'm saying this with a smile, but yeah, if you've ever seen a cat playing with a mouse, it's nasty. It really is. And though I won't say right now our most urgent priority is reprogramming cats, yeah, if we have a kind of 100-year plan to phase out the biology of suffering, well, yeah, it's feasible.
So let's ask Eduardo about lovebirds, because that like, what do you think? You know, Eduardo, the animal on your shoulder now, would you like to be able to talk to that being, or is that not of any interest to you? Have you ever thought of that?
I think that, first of all, reducing suffering is very noble, but I think it's more complex. We would need to understand what is going on in the mind of other people or other beings. So the value of talking, you know, with Pishu, that's his name, that would be very valuable for me, because it would provide me with an input of information that then I can process, and then I can say, well, this is what he likes, this is what he dislikes. It's up to me to do more of what he likes, to reduce his suffering. And I find that very complex. Let's not go with non-human animals, but just staying with humans, understanding different people that have different backgrounds is already a challenge for us. So it strikes me that a problem that we could address in our lifetime is that miscommunication in between people, and bring it to a point in which we can understand each other and empathize, and then based on that begin proposing legislation or some sort of regulation that would allow us to reduce the suffering of the people that are right now experiencing it. And we could use technology as we're using it right now, I think. Via video conference, I could communicate with someone that is in Rwanda or in Botswana and know what is going on through their minds and know what is bothering them, and see if at some level, even if it's very minimal, I can provide some sort of assistance. So how would you propose to begin addressing that miscommunication that exists based on your background and on what you study?
There are all kinds of ways that I could suggest involving improving the environment, not our biology or genetics, that in our environment, that would improve default quality of life, everything from universal basic income to healthcare that is free to guaranteed accommodation to an enormous laundry list of ways in which I think the world could be improved. But such is the nature of the negative feedback mechanisms of the hedonic treadmill, then even if this long shopping list were implemented, nonetheless, a lot of people would spend a lot of their lives miserable, angst-ridden, lovelorn, other things being equal, discontent, or being discontented a lot of the time is good for our genes, even if it's bad for us. And so if we're serious about preventing, mitigating, and eventually abolishing suffering, we need to tackle hedonic set points, the hedonic treadmill, and aim for hedonic uplift. Now, one of the biggest challenges here is that the neurotransmitter system most involved in hedonic tone, pain is the opioid system, particularly the mu opioid receptors. And we know America is in the throes of an opioid crisis. Countless people suffer chronic pain, and the treatment of depression, anxiety disorders is still pretty dismal. And though this is not a universally accepted opinion, this is my personal opinion, this is because the opioid neurotransmitter signaling system is taboo. I mean, imagine trying to tackle juvenile diabetes without being able to offer insulin. It's that bad. However, some rather good news, or potentially very good news, is that a few months ago, the Luxembourg Institute of Health announced a discovery of a newly discovered opioid receptor, dual function receptor, that seems to play a critical role in hedonic regulation and essentially regulation of your kind of natural levels, endogenous levels of opioids, that this receptor traps, sequesters endogenous opioids that your brain produces, preventing them acting on the receptors. And researchers at Luxembourg Institute of Health have developed the first of what's going to be probably a whole series of compounds, LIH383, essentially that blocks this receptor. And if all goes well, this means that not merely depressives and people in pain, but theoretically, everyone can benefit, will be able to benefit from endogenous, a richer level of endogenous opioids, i.e. this is sabotaging one of the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain. And I'd be very interested to see trials of this receptor blocker with selective kappa opioid antagonists. Kappa is the nasty opioid receptor. And the long-term vision here, and I stress this is very early days and there are countless pitfalls. The idea here is some kind of hedonic uplift, ratcheting up hedonic range and hedonic set points. So essentially, eventually, everyone ought to be able to enjoy a high default quality of life. But to be successful, it's important to retain information sensitivity, i.e. not getting people blissed out, but just essentially imagine waking up in the morning and being in an extremely good mood. You would still have your core values and preferences. This isn't a case of you're having to subordinate your preferences and desires to anyone else, but nonetheless your default hedonic tone being much higher than today. Anyone listening is probably, and rightly so, thinking of all the possible ways things could go wrong. I can list some of them, but the reason I've just gone into a bit of molecular detail just now is to show this isn't just philosophers talking, that in principle, at any rate, clinical psychopharmacology, medical genetics can engineer such a transition if we want to live in a happy world. And I tentatively predict that over the next 100, 200, 300 years, there will be a biohappiness revolution. And eventually, perhaps, a few centuries from now, any form of experience below hedonic zero will be physically impossible. And I think our successors will look back on the kind of the dark Darwinian era and think of it as a kind of nightmare age. Possibly they'll want to forget about it altogether.
So the students may be thinking about like protecting yourself against touching a hot stove and stuff like that. But the idea is that you would notice reduction in your feeling of well-being, even if you're still feeling happy. But if you get close to a hot stove, you suddenly be aware that you're much less happy. It may not be pain, but it would cause you to move your hand back so that you wouldn't get burned. Similarly, when somebody close to you dies and you go through a grieving process, it could be similar to that you're still happy, but you're aware that you're definitely less happy than you used to be before this person died and you started that grieving process. So the same gradient is there. It just has a higher top and a lower bottom. Is that right, David?
Yes,
is that
that's fair. I mean, some people would say, that they would want others to suffer terrible grief, not just the functional analogues of grief, but real grief. But although, this is my opinion, although if I were to keel over from a heart attack now, I would want it to diminish people's well-being. I would not want anyone to suffer on my account, because in the longer term, of course, I'm a transhumanist. I would hope to live in a world in which there is no aging and we can abolish such misfortune. But that is That is much, much further in the future. But for now, yes, ratcheting up hedonic range, diminishing susceptibility to pain, because something like SCN9A, this volume knob for pain, as well as nonsense mutations that completely abolish not just pain, but also nociception. There are other benign mutations that confer a very high pain tolerance. And sadly, there are also mutations that induce something like man on fire syndrome, very, pretty ghastly, hyperalgesia, extreme pain sensitivity. But essentially, we should be choosing both for ourselves and big moral responsibility for our future children, approximately how much we want them to suffer.
Do you have any thoughts on having some input of sorrow? Because, you know, if we go to the hedonistic life, do you fear that at some point humans that live so happily will stagnate, and they will potentially think, this is okay, we don't need to evolve in any other way because this is okay? Do you see that as a danger, or do you predict somehow that these humans that are happy will still have that drive to continue developing into better societies?
This is, you've sketched the kind of the Brave New World scenario. Recalling Huxley's Brave New World, well, it wasn't the members there aren't genetically predestined to bliss, but they do have access to soma, this ideal pleasure drug, hangoverless tranquilizer. In many ways, soma is a combination of a benign opioid, alcohol, even elements of MDMA, ecstasy. And yes, some people are worried that a world full of happy beings would stagnate, just lotus eaters. However, if you look at the very happiest people today, they tend to be extroverts, sensation seekers. They're not merely more motivated, but they respond to a broader range of stimuli. It tends to be depressives more who get stuck in the rut. And yeah, essentially we can choose if we want to turn ourselves long-term into lotus eaters, blissfully happy, but essentially stagnating, we can do so. But neuroscience is also teasing out the basis, not just of bliss, but also motivation. Crudely, bliss, mu, opioid activation of your hedonic hotspots, motivation, drive, anticipated reward, mesolimbic dopamine system. So it's quite possible that our successors, maybe even our elderly selves, but I'll say it's quite possible our successors not merely will be far, far happier than we are today, but also much more motivated too. It's possible to have super happiness and hypermotivation, and hypermotivation is going to be associated with, the drive to pursue, our wildest dreams, our biggest ambitions. So long as you're preserving information sensitivity to good and bad stimuli. As I'll just one point, I think quite a lot of people will draw this distinction. They'll say what's important isn't getting rid of suffering or happiness, it's meaning. And they may not agree what the meaning is, but meaning. But what is striking is that as we get happier, life tends to seem even more meaningful and significant. No one says, I feel blissfully happy, but my life feels empty and meaningless. And if we want to create a more meaningful world, then the way to do so is to enrich the biological substrates of happiness.
So in the last 20 minutes of this session, I'd like to talk about my aspirations for the students on the one hand, and for humanism, humanity plus, and on the other, and for a world without suffering, as you have described it. So when the course began 9 years ago, I was already in a circumstance of sort of enmeshed in the world of young people. I share my office with the young people that I'm training. The only people I can talk to during the workday are people between the ages of 15 and 33, because those are the people around me and so on. And I believed simplistically that we could do something that was absolutely incorrect. We could not do this. That I could interest the young people in transhumanism and all its facets, and they could fix the fractiousness of the transhumanism community with the wonderful joie de vivre and so on of young people, you know, that they wouldn't get caught up in all the, you know, the sort of bullshit of the older transhumanism conflicts, and they would fix everything. And so in 2011, 2012, 2013, I proposed this. Corey Fung was the first student to actually sign on to your Facebook group. I think he's still there, but he's completely inactive. And in fact, just to make this a really short story, I failed completely. Not a single student who's ever taken the course has in a sustained way you know, continue to interact with any sort of, you know, transhumanism society. And it just hasn't worked. Absolutely hasn't worked. And it's true that I have great students surrounding me and taking the course, but that their greatness, their spirit, has not done anything to heal the fractiousness of the transhumanism community. And in fact, it sort of goes beyond that, that I think the students, the one thing about me they don't understand is why I would think they would want to do this. Or, you know, like, it's not their motivation for taking the course. They didn't take the course because they wanted to fix the fractiousness of the transhumanism community. They could care less about that. So anyway, maybe it's simply comical that I don't get what life is all about, and I should just give up my quest to have the students in this course fix the, you know, transhumanism movement, so the suffering in transhumanism is reduced to zero, rather than having people all fight with each other and so on. So let's ask the students, are there any of you who are at all inspired to become the young person who can fix the fractiousness of the transhumanism community? Or does that sound like the most ridiculous proposal anyone has ever made for something you might do?
I think it's too far away. And also, many of the students that are enrolled in any of the university courses, we have our own projects and our own time to allocate to these projects, right? And transhumanism, you know, transcending from humans to humans plus, or, you know, into a ceramic slab, as you have said. So far away from where we are right now, that maybe people just see it as such a big challenge that it paralyzes us, right? How could I contribute with what I am doing to fix that problem of how are we going to get there? I think that overall we may get there, but very, very slowly and with small progress that will be done maybe by one graduate student in a different part of the world and another.
But not one of you guys. Yeah.
Not one of us. So then it will be a collective effort, but it may take hundreds of years to get there. Yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah, so Taryn says, this conversation has been really inspiring to me, actually. Always considered transhumanism to be a selfish pursuit, but David's description of it as social justice project is extremely exciting to me. Okay, so maybe Taryn's the person then. Person I've been looking for all these 9 years. David, what do you think? First of all, you were one of the co-founders of the...
Essentially, yeah. Nick Glostrom and I co-founded the World Transhumanist Association in 1998. And although for the first decade or so of this century, it was the transhumanist organization, transhumanism has fragmented into many different currents. Nick, as you know, he's ensconced at Future of Humanity Institute, in Oxford, focused very much on issues of superintelligence, existential risk. I'm essentially a writer, and Wikipedia calls me a philosopher, but in England one doesn't go around calling oneself a philosopher. So yeah, essentially I am a writer. I know my design limitations, but yes, essentially there is something of a leadership vacuum. There are many different currents of transhumanism, and yes, I mean, clearly I would love to see the particular strand of transhumanism that is closest to my heart. I mean, I sometimes define transhumanism in terms of the three supers: super longevity, super intelligence, and super happiness. But you've probably gathered that closest to my heart is the problem of suffering in humans and non-humans. And so how the movement and transhumanist ideas evolve over the next decades and centuries, I don't know. In practice, it may well be that, some larger than life, charismatic billionaire, you see, takes some of these ideas and runs with them. I mean, Elon Musk, for instance, read Superintelligence, which had a big impact on his thought. And although Elon Musk with Neuralink is not saying, "Hello, I'm a transhumanist," nonetheless, transhumanist ideas inform, a lot of his work. In a different world, I would be, out there networking, campaigning, but politics, calls, or business call for a very different set of skills. And I haven't got the strength of personality to do it, to be honest. You need to have as well as being, social skills, you also need to have quite a thick skin, be psychologically resilient, because ultimately we are all, and I'm definitely including transhumanists here, we're all basically, sort of chimpanzee politics. And the only way to cease to be kind of Machiavellian apes is going to be using all our kind of Machiavellian skills to claw our way out of the abyss of Darwinian life. And as long as I'm capable of doing so, I'm going to continue writing and occasionally doing a bit of talking. But sad to say, I'm not going to be leading the revolution.
Right. So let me the last 10 minutes talk about what's happened to me personally. So in the last Humanity Plus Summit, it exists as a video, which you can watch. And there is something absolutely remarkable about it. There was an associated 1-minute video contest. Many of you are aware that I did that 1-minute video. And so the council, Humanity Plus leadership, chose some winners, but then there was great dissatisfaction. So they agreed on a people's choice, and time went by, weeks and weeks and weeks, and I wrote to them about this. And they said that, well, that unfortunately I hadn't been the People's Choice winner. But what was interesting is clearly the People's Choice, according to them, was the weakest video of all, right? I mean, it's just obvious that it is. And so they never announced it. So there was no announcement, and there, I think, will never be, because that's just, it's just part of this sort of dysfunction of who the People's Choice winner was. But during the conference itself, there was a lot of reference of the metaphor of staying in your own lane, which is a very primitive idea that I think doesn't advance anybody, but was particularly directed to me because the leadership felt that I, as a physician, should be doing doctorish things, physicianish things. A lot of the stuff that I was doing, and poetry and music and advocacy of various causes and so on, was just, I'm in all the lanes. I should stay in my own lane. And you'll find that phrase repeated by the moderator over and over again. It's not just said once. Stay in your own lane. What is that like? It's like the reaction to any creative person, particularly the less creative boss of a creative person. They're saying, what you doing? What you doing? Like, you are not conforming. There's something wrong with you. You are not conforming. The rest of us go to barbers to get professional haircuts. You're not doing that. That's really bad, So that's the remarkable thing. If you watch that video, these are the leaders of, Humanity Plus doing their best to put on a major conference. And this was the theme: stay in your own lane. And, it's not just my opinion. You can watch the thing and see it. You can also see if you can find any evidence that the People's Choice winner of the 1-minute video contest was ever announced, and it never was. Anyway, that's my local recent history with that organization. They particularly thought that my 1-minute video was aspiring to do a lot of non-medical stuff, right? I'm a doctor. Why was I talking about genetic engineering of radio-resistant humans? Why aren't I try to cure COVID or something purely medical, and why am I talking about mind uploading? And, basically everything I talked about in that 1 minute, that was sort of illegal for a physician applicant, or maybe that no physicians should apply to a 1-minute video contest. So, Taryn, I hope that in telling you this, I haven't reduced your interest in this area. I think it'd be great if you and David had some direct interaction about what you might like to do. So as you know, we offer in the course this idea that for your final project, you can be mentored by anyone who's ever taught in the course. Doesn't mean that they do the work for you, but they can kind of provide guidance and advice or little tweaks here and there that might be useful. And I would suggest that Taryn would perhaps have some interaction with David, and I think that would be great. Yeah, good. Okay, so is that a successful outcome or what? So Taryn has just said she's ordered his books and will be in touch about the term project. So been hoping to put a social justice spin on it for a while. Thanks for this. Okay, cool. So we have 3 minutes left. Who else would like to raise something? Or David, have you been inspired to say some final words?
Yeah, as I said, at its best, I mean, yeah, the Transhumanist Declaration of 1998, reaffirmed 2009, affirms our commitment to the well-being of all sentients. Yes, I think that the well-being of all sentients should be the bedrock of any future society, and at least in outline, it's now possible to sketch how this is feasible. I fear, being one of nature's super pessimists, that probably hundreds of years of pain and suffering still lie ahead, but nonetheless, transhuman and eventually post-human life can be wonderful, far more wonderful than anything we are physiologically capable of conceiving today, and I think that's a goal worth striving for. Yeah, great. Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to write to Taryn and give her your email, and so I think great things will come out of this. You may think this is always the way every teaching session works, where the external person at the end connects in some highly significant way with one of the students and so on. But actually, I think this is the first time in the course this has happened in such a magical way. So I wish everything good for this interaction between David and Taryn here. And yeah, no, I think that's absolutely great. Well, David, as always, it's been fantastic. And thank you very much. You know, our session on Tuesday, I frightened to death the guests by suggesting that we would just go on talking, and so they clearly had lots of other things scheduled, and they couldn't imagine a worse suggestion that we would keep on talking after the 80-minute period. So anyway, I won't frighten you in a similar way, but thank you very much. We have enjoyed this immensely. I think it was very good for the students, and it will be good for the video audience in, you know, at large. Some of our videos have up to 6,000 people watching, so it's not inconsequential what we do here, eh? So we can change the world, why not? And one student at a time, we can do it. Okay. Any other final words? Yeah. No, as I said, I very much look forward to a future of superhuman bliss. I'm skeptical that I'm going to live to see it, but who knows? One of your proteges could be taking the project forward.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.